Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. My name's Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, which is hosting the conference. The McFarland Center sponsors conferences, lectures, and exhibits, performances, and the like that explore basic human questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. We aim to be a forum for intellectual exchange that is interreligious, as well as interdisciplinary, intercultural, and international in scope. Lots of inters, right? The conference that we embark on today seems like a perfect fulfillment of that aspiration. I'll leave it to Professor Predrag Cetrovatsky to say more about what draws us here. What I do want to do is acknowledge the people who have made this event possible and make sure that you know that you can be in touch with me should you have any special questions or needs. Professor Predrag Cetrovatsky and Professor Olga Partain have done a really marvelous job in conceiving and bringing this conference to fulfillment, and I'm really grateful to them. Since that intellectual organizational task often falls to me for conferences, I'm really glad to have two marvelous, well-informed people who have done that in my stead, and they're here to guide us. I get to learn from them and from all the great scholars that we've brought here today, and I know that we have some really wonderful scholars, and I'm grateful to everyone for coming. Second, I want to acknowledge the generosity of the Ream family, the namesakes of this beautiful space where we're meeting, and it was the Ream Family Fund that made it possible for us to gather. I'd also like to thank Pat Hinchliff and Danielle Kane from the McFarland Center who do all the logistical work. As Predrag and Olga know better than anyone else, they are responsible for a good deal of the work that's been done here. I want to acknowledge and thank the music department, Jan Molasharash, and the great concert that they have in store for you tonight. He's a really marvelous cellist, and he's brought together two friends and colleagues who are going to perform, and I know that will be really great this evening. Father Mike Rogers, a Jesuit in the back, sort of raising his hand, is also here, works for our center. He's a fellow, and he and I are here if you need anything in particular, any directions or advice or help with things on campus. So we're glad to do that. On an all too mundane note, if you haven't heard, I need to ask that you not bring food or drink into Ream Library, other than water, so we'll have some water for you later. We will have some good meals to nourish your bodies outside of this space, and we have some great conversation to nourish your minds here. So I hope you won't notice the absence of any coffee in here this morning. Before Predrag introduces us to start us on our way, I'd like to introduce Father Phil Burrows of the Society of Jesus, the president of the college, to just say a few words of welcome.
Well, this isn't the lovely spring day we had hoped for, but maybe it's a wonderful gray day to be indoors and to be listening to important thoughts. So we welcome you to Worcester. And on behalf of the College of the Holy Cross, I would like to welcome our international guests and our U.S. scholars, as well as our own faculty and staff and students who have come together today to explore Tolstoy's spiritual search for life's meaning and purpose in light of his rediscovery of Christianity. And further, like Tom, I would like to thank Professors Predrag Cetrovatsky and Olga Partain for organizing this conference, and the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture, the Departments of Modern Languages, Philosophy, and Music, and the Peace and Conflict Studies Concentration and the Montserrat Program for co-sponsoring this international conference. The nature of this interdisciplinary work is reflected in the nature of all those who are sponsoring today's and tomorrow's events. While Tolstoy's literary genius was fueled by his relentless questioning, he also was tortured by his endless search for meaning and for purpose. And while we are the beneficiaries of his artistic creativity, his restless heart didn't find the inner peace of Augustine or the spiritual consolation of Ignatius of Loyola or Teresa of Avila. But like Tolstoy, Augustine, Ignatius, and Teresa, as an academic community at Holy Cross, we have committed ourselves to join in dialogue about basic human questions. As our institutional mission statement goes on to suggest, individually and collectively, we search for the moral character of teaching and learning. We seek to discover meaning in life and history, and we work to identify and to fulfill our obligations to one another, especially to the world's most vulnerable. And so just as Tolstoy struggled, we also struggle to be patient with ambiguity and uncertainty as we examine together fundamental religious and philosophical questions. So hopefully, The dialogue which you will have over the next 2 days will, as our mission statement directs, remain open to the sense of the whole, which calls us to transcend ourselves and challenges us to seek that which might constitute our common humanity. It seems to me that because of our shared values at Holy Cross, this is a particularly appropriate intellectual community to host this conference. And given your hosts, I know that you will be well cared for and creatively challenged in your reflections. So I want to thank you for coming today and tomorrow to the College of the Holy Cross. And now I'd like to ask Professor Tchikovsky, who will set the stage for all that follows. Predrag.
Good morning. The title of my introductory remarks is Our Uneasiness with Tolstoy. I would like to remind you of the Zen Buddhist saying, when I was a cloud looked like a cloud, a tree looked like a tree, and a mountain looked like a mountain. Then I grew up, became knowledgeable and wise, and a cloud did not look like a cloud anymore, nor a tree like a tree, nor a mountain like a mountain. But then I grew old, and a cloud looked again like a cloud, and a tree like a tree, and a mountain like a mountain. I wonder if this Zen saying does not correctly describe our shifting attitudes toward Tolstoy. When he was alive, while his voice was thundering out of his God-forsaken Yasnaya Polyana, it was heard far enough throughout the world. And then, as the 20th century became absorbed in its absurdly destructive and inhumane wars and violence, as the screams of the tortured human souls became louder, while Tolstoy's messages of peace and brotherly love did not entirely disappear, they seemed obsolete, utopian, even ridiculous. Instead of Tolstoy, it appeared that to the educated audience, that it was Dostoevsky and his tortured and twisted heroes whom we could hear better and who voiced our own pain and struggles more clearly and decisively. Of course, we continue to read and teach Tolstoy, yet always with a certain but, a reservation that reflected our respect, but also our cold distance from Tolstoy. All too often, throughout the 20th century, Tolstoy was treated like a cartoon character, an easy target for any kind of smart criticism. Hardly anyone, perhaps besides Gandhi, took Tolstoy's pervert philosophizing of love and nonviolence seriously. Tolstoy was not Tolstoy anymore. But the tide of times may be changing again. Or I should say, the tide is changing, but it's not always easy to recognize it because we are in the midst of it. The most unchristian wars and destruction and violence continue to be waged, even if not our front yard, especially if you are European, then in our backyards, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and throughout the Middle East. At home, we have reached an unenviable level of prosperity and a feverish obsession with material goods and technological innovations. Nothing wrong with that, right? Nothing indeed. Except for something that the sages of all ages have known and warned us about. Money and the hoarding of material goods do not lead to happiness. What is more, they are likely to blind us for genuine values in life and distract us from our pursuit of them. And while our obsession with money fills our pockets and our bank accounts, it also reveals how empty have our lives become. somewhere in this world, overcrowded with material and technical goods, and impoverished of human emotions and compassion, the question that Tolstoy pounded on and repeated far too many times for the good taste of the middle and upper classes of men and women begins to loom large again. The question, prosaic and annoying as it has always been, is, what's the meaning of life? For decades past, this question has been repeated and dissected like the proverbial frog in a lab, only in freshman classes of the introductory philosophy courses, perhaps primarily to demonstrate just how darn smart these philosophers have been and how irrelevant their theories have become. For Tolstoy, it is a genuine question, a loaded and burning question, the question on which depends not only our peace of mind, but perhaps our entire existence, at least insofar as this existence had to be understood in a humanistic and spiritual way. Do I really live like a human being? And should I continue my existence if I cannot determine its meaning and purpose? And why live in this empty, unfeeling, smart new world? When Professor Olga Bartan and I started thinking about this conference and its title, we were wavering between the two of them, Tolstoy and Christianity and Tolstoy and Spirituality. Interestingly enough, it's the participants of this conference who insisted that spirituality should be in the title. Why spirituality rather than Christianity? One reason probably is that Tolstoy was as much a pagan as he was a Christian, as much of the follower of the Buddha, and perhaps of Lao Tzu, as he was an admirer of Jesus. I take it that spirituality means something broader than religion, and that it is broad enough to encompass every religion, Christianity included. But it may also be that spirituality is a better word and a more genuine concern, because it is spirituality that gives us some hope that we can find an antidote to our world devastated by materialistic ravaging, emptied of human feelings, meaning, and purpose. The third and most important reason may be a changing attitudes toward Tolstoy's works and his mission. Perhaps the time has come that we for once try to dispel the mist of self-deceptions we like to surround ourselves with. And, as the Zen Buddhist wisdom indicated, to see once more a cloud is a cloud, a tree is a tree, a mountain is a mountain, and Tolstoy is Tolstoy. Only time will tell. But the participants of this conference will surely have something to say about that as well. Let us welcome them all with a round of applause. I want to invite Professor Olga Bartan to introduce our first speaker.
It is my honor today to present our first speaker, one of the leading contemporary Russian writer, essayist, and translator, Mikhail Shishkin. Mikhail Shishkin is the author of 3 novels: Взятие Измаила, Taking of Ismail, 2000, Venerian Volos, 2005, now available in English as Maidenhair, and Письмовник, 2013, now available in English under the title The Light and the Dark. Mikhail Shishkin is the only Russian writer who received all 3 of major literary prizes: Booker Prize, National Bestseller Prize, and Big Book Award. Shishkin's books have been translated into more than 30 languages. His prose is universally praised for style, as it deals with universal themes like death, resurrection, and love. Shishkin admits to being influenced by Chekhov along with Leo Tolstoy and Ivan Bunin, saying, I quote, "Bunin taught me not to compromise and to go on believing in myself. Chekhov passed on his sense of humanity, that there can't be any wholly negative characters in your text. And from Tolstoy, I learned not to be afraid of being naive." Mikhail Shishkin's talk today is called "But to Continue the Life, for What Purpose?"
Many years ago, when I was in school, I used to take a book to the coat room or library between classes and hide. The worst, weakest coward in the senior class used to bully me, dishing it out as hard as he got it himself. He'd box my ears. I'd read about medieval jesters asking their lords tricky questions, and the lords trying to give painstakingly correct answers, and invariably just making fools of themselves. One day, I tried mocking my tormentor the same way, but he just boxed my ears as usual, before I could even finish my flowery remark. All the silver tongues in the world, all the philosophers and theologians, with their confident hope of living on in time, are just like those bookish boys, forever trying to cheat death with their flowery disputations, but in the end, death doesn't even bother to hear them out. It just boxes their ears. There was one man, though, who asked very naive, rather than sophisticated questions his whole life. In Confessions, he writes, "Fine, you will have 6,000 desetinas in Samara province and 300 horses. What then? Fine, you will be more famous than Gogol or Pushkin, or Shakespeare or Molière, or any other writer in the world. What of it?" It sounds very naive. But this isn't the small-minded naivety of a backward personality, though. Tolstoy's naivety shakes the universe to its very foundations, a naivety with an earthquake's power. Several months before his death, he wrote in his diary, "Machines to produce what? Telegraphs to convey what? Schools, universities, and academies to teach what? Assemblies to discuss what? Books and newspapers to spread information. About what? Railways for traveling where? To see whom? Millions of people assembled under a single command to do what? Death boxed his ears more than 100 years ago, but he didn't care and went on asking his questions, and he still is. Hospitals, doctors, and pharmacies to prolong life. But to prolong life, to what end? In the summer of 1816, Lord Byron walked from Lake Geneva to the Bernese Oberland and left us a description of that walk in his diary. 40 years later, Tolstoy took the exact same roads and also kept a diary. They were both 28. Tolstoy didn't know he was repeating the famous Englishman's path, otherwise he would undoubtedly have chosen himself a different route. When I found myself in Switzerland, I had to take the same path with my notebook. How could I not? I walked for several days, and out of it came 7 chapters of my book in the footsteps of Byron and Tolstoy. What led the retired officer and budding man of letters to Switzerland during his travels through Western Europe in the spring of 1857? Visiting the Alpine Republic had not entered into his plans initially. This was more like an escape than tourism. Tolstoy was fleeing headlong from Paris to Geneva, fleeing death. The young man had just returned from war, where he had seen many deaths, but this was a special death. One April morning, he had been part of a crowd of Gurkhas observing the workings of the guillotine. Chopped off was the head of a certain François Richer, who had been convicted of the murder of 2 men with intent to rob. That same day, Tolstoy wrote to his friend Bodkin, "I saw many horrors in war, and the Caucasus as well, but if they had torn a man to pieces in front of me, it would not have been as repulsive as this elegant, sophisticated machine they used to kill a strong, fresh, healthy man in one instant. There what we had was not sensible will, but the human emotion of passion, whereas here there is a refined tranquility and convenience to murder and nothing magnificent at all. The impudent, insolent desire to carry out justice, the law of God, a justice decided by lawyers, each of whom, while grounding himself in honor, religion, and truth, says the opposite. With the same formalities did they kill the king and Chenier and the Republicans and the aristocrats and the gentleman, I've forgotten his name, who 2 years ago was judged innocent of a murder for which he was killed. The crowd is repulsive, too. A father who explains to his daughter what an exquisite and convenient mechanism this is accomplished by, and so on. Human law is nonsense. To be sure, the state is a conspiracy not only for the exploitation, but, most important, for the corruption of its citizens. In his diary for April 6, 1857, he writes, "Fat, white, a healthy neck and chest. The guillotine long would not let me sleep and forced me to look back. Tolstoy is harassed by nightmares and can't sleep. He tells his friends about this. Aksakov writes in one letter that what Turgenev told him about Tolstoy. He dreamed of the guillotine. It seemed to him that he himself was being executed. Waking up, he found a scratch on his neck, which frightened him terribly, and he explained to himself that it was the devil who'd scratched him. And all of a sudden, he'd vanished, and he was now writing from the shores of Lake Geneva." The guillotine lopped off all of Tolstoy's life previous in a single blow. In his 28 years, he had seen and experienced quite a lot, enough to last anyone else a lifetime. University had disenchanted him, and he had abandoned his studies. So it would be with everything he took up. He couldn't be like other people and make any occupation his life's course. He would abandon the army, pedagogy, running his estate, and his zemstvo activities. He only managed to do one thing, write books. But even this occupation he tried to abandon more than once, even soon after his first success with his book Childhood, Boyhood, Youth, whose publication instantly made him one of Russia's leading authors. In Confession, he recalled how at age 26 he arrived in Petersburg after the Crimean War and being accepted into writer's circle. The view on life these people, my writing confederates, had was that, on the whole, life is constantly developing and that we, men of thought, have the main part in this development. And of all people of the mind, we artists and poets have the most influence. Our calling is to teach people. Tolstoy felt like the adherent of a new religion. This belief in the significance of poetry and the development of life was a belief, and I was one of its priests. The famous writer's status promised him not only renown, wealth, and the love of women in his lifetime, but also the hope of immortality, if only literary. But his feeling of belonging to a caste of priests did not last long. In my second, and especially my third year of this life, I began to doubt the infallibility of this belief. Disenchantment with literature was the reason for his trip to Europe, and the execution in Paris inflicted the coup de grace on his belief. Confession was written in 1879, 20 years after this event, which may have been the key event in his life. When I saw the head separated from its body and both clattering separately in the box, I understood, not intellectually, but with my entire being, that no theories of the rationality, of what is or of progress could justify this act, and that no matter if all the people of the world, based on whatever theories, since the world's creation, have found this necessary, I know that this is not necessary, that this is bad, and that therefore the judge of what is good and necessary is not what people say and do, and not progress, but I myself and my heart. This was a declaration of war against an imperfect world. After this time, his human essence would be protest, rebellion, and denial. During his Swiss journey, Tolstoy spends a night in Grindelwald and writes in his diary, "Sensuality is a terrible torment. I couldn't get to sleep until 12 and paced around my room and the hallway. I went to take a walk through the gallery to the light of the moon, glaciers, and black mountains. I groped the downstairs maid and the upstairs one too. She'd run past me a few times, and I thought she was expecting it. Everyone had gone to bed, and she ran past me again and looked around at me angrily. Downstairs I hear, I've raised the whole house, and they've taken me for a malfaiteur. Schuft steht immer. I suppose everybody here understands German, yeah? So it would be translated like Schuft, like scoundrel. Steht immer is up all the time. These notes were not intended for publication. They were published only after his death. These notes are an honest and pitiless attempt at self-examination. What torments this healthy young man, what he fears and is ashamed of, finds its expression on practically every page. He is oppressed by the duality of the human being, part of whom belongs to God, while the other part is in the grip of lust. This harrowing contradiction would pursue him his whole life. He experienced disgust before slipping into the animal nature, as he could not reconcile himself to everything banal and ordinary that comprises human existence. God forbid living only for this world, he would write in his diary much later, in October 1901. For life to have meaning, its aim must lie beyond the limits of this world, beyond the reach of the human mind. Tolstoy resolves the issue radically to arrive at the rejection of lust and base human instincts. In one letter he writes, "Unjust is your assumption that good is intended for both the spiritual and the corporeal principle. Good is characteristic only of the spiritual principle and consists in none other than an increasing liberation from the body, which is doomed to evil and which alone impedes the achievement of the good of the spiritual principle." Thus writes a man who brought 13 children into the world. It was this chasm between the ideas of a moralist and the hand of an artist, between this human nature and his attempts to overcome it, that makes Tolstoy Tolstoy, who even today arouses our admiration and revulsion, our incomprehension and love. In order to live on this sinful earth, one needs to develop an immunity against the many things that poison our life. This immunity was totally absent in Tolstoy. He was ill with life, and there was no medicine for this. It is impossible to get along in one's daily existence without a certain bare minimum of baseness. One needs simply to accept as a given that evil exists, that millions of people live in poverty, and that there will always be wars. Now we do know that somewhere innocent people are being tortured in prisons, missiles are falling on people's homes, children are dying from lack of medical care, but this does not prevent us from having breakfast, laughing, earning money, bearing children, telling jokes. Everyone does this, and we do this. We live trying to remain at our own low rung of baseness and not descend any lower. But Tolstoy didn't want to, could not live the way we do. That life tormented him with constant shame. Here he saw a poor woman in the freezing cold, and writes in his diary that he saw a hungry old woman freezing while he was warm in his sheepskin coat and was on his way home to gorge on eggs. To us, this seems ridiculous. What naivety! It seems to me that Tolstoy's most important lesson is this: we need to learn to be naive. Under the naive gaze, all the usual connections that hold our world together are torn asunder, and everything falls apart in chaos. This is a dangerous ability that's hard to live with. The flood wiped only the surface of the face of the earth. After every creature was preserved and chose, and with it a belief in the meaning of creation and the necessity of life. In Tolstoy, the very foundations of being are shaken. Very foundations of being are shaken. Without knowledge of what I am and why I am here, I cannot live. And I cannot know this, consequently, I cannot live. So says his hero. But there is no doubt that these words were achieved through Tolstoy's own suffering. It was he who could not live without knowing why. His burning desire was to be rid of all these thoughts, contradictions, and doubts, to be rid of the necessity of leading an ordinary family life, to be rid of himself, of his own mind, to become mad, a holy fool. If I were on my own, I wouldn't be a monk, I'd be a holy fool, he writes to Strakhov in 1877. That is, I would treasure nothing in life and would do no one evil. He was able to realize this dream only at the end of his long life, when he left home in order to become no one, a nameless wanderer. 18-year-old Sonia Bers married the man who had this hell in his soul. The catastrophe was pre-programmed. Literary scholar Viktor Shklovsky wrote sympathetic lines about Sofia Andreevna in his biography of Tolstoy. In that house, she was the envoy from reality. She reminded him that the children should live like everyone else, that they had to have money, they had to marry off their daughters, and their sons had to graduate from high school and university. He could not quarrel with the government, or else they might exile him. He had to be a famous writer. He had to write another book like Anna Karenina. She herself had to publish the books the way Dostoevsky's wife published his, and moreover, be in society and not among odd, dubious people. She was the representative of the good sense of the day, the focus of the prejudice of the time. She wanted Tolstoy to be an ordinary, normal person, whereas he wanted to reject all his wealth, give away his land and all his property to his peasants, and give up all rights to the publication of his books, considering it especially amoral to profit by his own words, and suggested to her a simple life in poverty, and his soul's salvation and hers. The more he insisted on leaving his estate and beginning a new, pure life, the harder she resisted, especially angry that he wanted to make beggars of a count's children and send them out into the world. Tolstoy would have left Yasnaya Polyana earlier had it not been for her weapon of last resort, suicide threats. In 1894, he writes in his diary that novels usually end when the hero and the heroine marry. He goes on, describing people's lives in such a way as to break off the description at the wedding is like describing a person's journey and breaking off the description at where the traveler is fallen upon by brigands. Anna Karenina is by no means a book about family drama or feminine passion, as has been assumed by the screenwriters who regularly subject the novel to vivisection, with more than 30 screen versions made to date. It is a novel about the black hole that swallows up each of us, and from which the writer tried all his life to save himself. Every person born comes into the world not only with a standard array of innards, but also with a cosmic void, which he or she carries around us inside. This hole sucks in not only the soul, but ultimately the body itself. We are used to tossing toys, lessons, work, career, family, fame, money, and hobbies into this voracious abyss. For most, this is enough. The size of the hole in someone's soul probably depends on the size of the soul itself. For Tolstoy and his outrageously cosmic hole, all this was utterly insufficient. Neither family happiness, nor wealth, nor the fame of Pushkin, Gogol, Shakespeare, and Molière put together could fill it. Why did Anna kill herself? What led this mother of two to her death? Was the lover who abandoned her to blame? Her hard-hearted spouse, not agreeable to a divorce? The society that rejected her? Or did the reason lie in her sense of guilt at having violated the commandment, "Thou shalt not commit adultery"? In her loss of a positive self-appraisal? The sensible view from the present day sees no reason for her, in her situation, to leave two children orphans. Does this mean that in the modern situation everything would have been all right for Anna? Then why, in prosperous, tolerant, human Switzerland, according to statistics, does one woman commit suicide daily? Tolstoy shares Anna's utter lack of immunity to life. What for others would be painless, for her crosses the threshold of pain. Her circle was happy to put up with her secret liaison with the young guard on condition that she hypocritically maintained certain appearances of decency. Just think, a lover. You simply have to be able to lie and prevaricate. But a lie would have been unworthy of this woman and was therefore impossible. Everyone has his or her own bare minimum of human dignity as well as baseness. Anna would rather have died than agree to turn her family life into a degrading farce, as the Oblonsky family had done. A woman fills her cosmic void with children, husband, house, daily cares, and work if she has it. But all this cannot fill the unfilled vacuum in her soul. A woman waits for a great love as the answer to all her questions. Her ultimate answer is all-consuming passion. It seems to her that her limitless emptiness can be filled only with limitless, selfless love. This vitally important need waits only for a chance. The object itself plays a secondary role. He could well be a handsome guard with a mustache trimmed in the latest fashion. That doesn't matter. Someone else could have taken Vronsky's place. All that's important is that, in the final analysis, no earthly man can withstand the competition with the role a great love assigns him. The majority manage without a great love, making do with ordinary ones. But Tolstoy gives his Anna the fatal talent of being unable to be satisfied with less. In her struggle for her great love, Anna sacrifices everything of value: social position, religion, family, children. For the novel's author, this path leads nowhere. The cosmic void cannot be filled by destroying and sacrificing both oneself and one's near and dear. The heroine's death is not great love's triumph, it is a crushing defeat. For Tolstoy, Levin is an attempt to find another path for struggling against the vacuum horrendum. Anna isn't searching. She already knows the answer. And this answer, salvation via all-consuming passion, pushes her into the abyss. Like his author, Levin seeks an answer in an effort to save himself from despair. And Levin, a man happy in his family, a healthy man, was several times so close to suicide that he did the rope lest he hang himself, and was afraid to walk about with a gun lest he shoot himself. But Levin neither shot nor hanged himself and continued to live. The path the author found for Levin is the indefatigable search. Tolstoy's hero finds his answer, whether or not the final one, we don't know, in love as well, but a completely different kind of love. The love and the epistle to the Corinthians. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. The novel ends with a statement from the author put in Levin's mouth. My life now, my whole life, regardless of whatever may happen to me, each minute of it, is not only not meaningless, as it was before, but possesses the undoubted meaning of that goodness I have the power to put into it. These words breathe of incantation, which is what they are. More than anything in the world, Tolstoy would have liked to lead this life and fill the hole in his soul with God and the idea of good. But this didn't work out for him. His pen filled his hero's soul to the brim with good, but not the author's. Tolstoy wanted to follow Levin's path, but in reality he followed the path of ruin like his heroine. He would rebel against religion. He would rebel against the foundations of society and statehood, against laws and property rights. He would disown his own books and art and family. In his home, endless family conflicts would turn into an unworthy farce, all the more humiliating because this was the Tolstoys and not the Oblonskys. Had Levin lived longer in the book, he would undoubtedly have repeated his greatest path, the path of disappointments. He never would find an answer to the questions of questions. The famous lines I began with were written not by a youth, but by an old man, just a few months before his death. Hospitals, doctors and pharmacies to prolong life, but prolong life to what end? His life was already coming to an end, and he still hadn't found his answer. All that was left was the void that had torn Anna apart and was now tearing him apart as well. The famous words of Bakunin, the ideologue of anarchism, the passion for destruction is a creative passion, help us understand the emotional makeup of the artist as well as the revolutionary. At the base of every creative individual lies a rejection of this world. The mightier the creative force, the more powerful its rejection of the status quo. Tolstoy's entire life was a rebellion against the humiliating banality of the everyday, against everything that distracts from the man, thing, and impedes the search for the answer of answers. Tolstoy's first rebellion against that inveterate liar's civilization, against the base arrangement of society, raged within the comfortable framework of the Rousseauist tradition. But his real rebellion was aimed at human nature itself and his own self. If the stream of life is flowing the wrong way, then for Tolstoy this meant that he should stand crosswise to that current and block it off with his person. He calls to be vegetarian, not to hunt, not to obey laws, to reject property and so forth, brought him fame as a righteous man, a great repenting sinner, a living saint. His power of illumination possessed such might that it brought him thousands of disciples and followers. But Tolstoy went further and rose up against two other most important sources of life that had distanced him from the divine in himself, the instinct to procreate and the creative instinct, his need to write. He wanted to disembarrass himself of skin and flesh, everything earthly, and leave only his naked soul, only his pure spirit, to wrest himself from the clutches of his animal nature and free himself from the artist's pride. The Kreutzer Sonata is a gauntlet thrown into the face of the Creator, who willed us to be fruitful and multiply, a declaration of war against life itself. Tolstoyan might is consistent throughout, even in its rejection of everything living on earth. His rejection of the corporeal leads ultimately to the notion of the extinction of humanity itself. But what about the human family? I don't know. I only know that the law of copulation is not mandatory for man. If at age 28, during his journey through Switzerland, he wrote about himself as writer, "You must be bold, otherwise you won't say anything other than what is graceful, and I need to say a great deal that is new and sound." Then, after he had proven to himself that he could write humanity's greatest novels, he simply repudiated them, stating that writing as such was not important. He spoke of art as something unnecessary and immoral. When his friends and family reproached him, saying he needed to continue writing, he grinned in reply. "You know, this reminds me of former admirers of an aging French tart telling her how ravishingly you lifted your little skirt and sang your little songs." Understandably, the Tolstoyan rejection of creativity was connected with that strange simultaneous sense of fullness and emptiness that overtakes a writer after completing a major work. He needs to catch his breath, take a gulp of air. Tolstoy's lungs needed a lot of air. The breathing of an ordinary mortal is barely enough to blow out a candle. Tolstoy's breath could warm a humanity that has turned to ice without love. When the next text came to him, he forgot all about his declarations and promises and sat down to write The Death of Ivan Ilyich, the Kreutzer Sonata, Haji Murat, works that were all written after his rejection of art and that belong among the best of world literature. The fear of death is a diligent muse. The fear of disappearing accompanies every person his whole life, but only with creative people do these onslaughts of horror bring on onslaughts of the energy that gives birth to paintings and books. In Notes of a Madman, Tolstoy describes an onslaught like this, familiar to each of us. I tried to think about what had interested me, a purchase, my wife, and not only was there nothing cheerful, but it had all turned into nothing. Everything was overshadowed by my horror of my perishing life. I needed to sleep. I went to lie down, but no sooner had I lain down than suddenly I jumped up in horror. The anguish, the spiritual anguish, such as happens before vomiting, only spiritual. It's awful. It's frightening. Death seems frightening, but you recall, you think about life, and it's the dying life that's frightening. Somehow life and death have merged into one. Something kept trying to tear my soul to pieces and couldn't. Once again, I went to look at the people sleeping. Once again, I tried to fall asleep. And still the same horror. Red, white, and square. A black hole through which death peers into your eyes takes on the shape of a square. The story was published posthumously in 1912. A year later, Kazimir Malevich begins to draw his own squares. In Tolstoy's notes, you are constantly coming across thoughts of the necessity and desirability of death. In May 1889, about Jean-Paul Richter, his story about a father who raised his children underground is good. They have to die in order to come into the light. And they wanted very badly to die. Or, life is the transition from one form to another form, the life of this world is the material for the new form, or the fear of death comes from the fact that people take for life one small part of it that is limited by their false notion, or another, substance and space, time and movement, separate me and all living things from all of God. Thoughts of death were the threads out of which all his years were woven. If we realize that Tolstoy's entire life, each minute, each second, was a conscious and desperate preparation for this most important moment of human existence, then we can understand all his eccentricities, quirks, and rejections. In essence, all his rebellions against nature, against the natural course of things, were his insurrection against death, against the inevitable end. After the sight of the guillotine in operation in Paris, the thought of death becomes his constant companion. And the more powerfully the fear of death torments him, the more powerfully his insurrection burns. On October 6, 1863, he writes in his diary, "I go rolling down the hill of death, and can barely feel the strength in me to stop. I don't want death. I like and love immortality." His whole life is this lost battle. His whole life is a gradual realization of his defeat, and then awareness that his defeat must simply be accepted. The only way to vanquish death is by accepting it. Tolstoy's might is in this acceptance and understanding. Hence follows his rejection of the values of life, of art, of what seems important to us all. The acceptance of death makes life and everything in it unimportant. We are used to death being an evil. One must be Tolstoy in order to assert that death is good and is not to be feared. I was riding through Turgeny forest in the evening dusk, fresh greenery in the forest underfoot, stars in the sky, the scents of blooming broom, a withering birch leaf, the sounds of nightingales, the buzz of beetles, a cuckoo and solitude, and the pleasant, brisk movement of your horse underneath you, and both physical and emotional health. And I thought, as I think constantly, about death. And it became so clear to me that it will be just as good on the other side of death, although in a different way. It was clear to me that it will be just as good there, no, better. The day his daughter Maria dies, he writes in his diary, November 26, 1906, just now, at 1 in the morning, Masha passed away. A strange feeling. I experienced neither horror nor fear, nor an awareness of something exceptional happening, nor even pity, grief. I seemed to feel it necessary to summon up inside me a special feeling of grief, and I did. But deep down in my soul, I was more at peace than at the act of a stranger, to say nothing of my own, a bad, improper action. Yes, this event is in the corporeal sphere, and for that reason indifferent. I watched her the whole time as she was dying, amazingly peacefully. For me, she was a being opening up before my own opening up. I followed its opening up, and it was joyous for me. But this opening up in a sphere accessible to me, life ceased. It is I ceased to be able to see this opening up. But what opened up is what is, where, when. These are questions related to the process of opening up here and cannot be applied to genuine, extraspatial, extratemporal life. For Tolstoy, death is not the decomposition of tissues, not the rotting of the bodies of the people he loved, but the salvation, the opening up of a person, that very answer to life's main question, the answer of the answers. He looked at the world from such a height that what is for us still separated appeared to him as a single whole. Death cannot take anything away from life because it cannot take anything away from itself. Tolstoy talks to a madman on the street and says goodbye to him. May we meet in the other world. Tolstoy is struck by the reply. What other world? There is only this world. Elsewhere he writes in his diary, I lay, drifting off. Suddenly something in my heart definitely broke. I thought, this is how death comes from a heart breaking, and I remained calm. No distress, no joy, but blissfully calm. Whether here or there, I know that I'm fine. This is what should be. As a child, in the arms of a mother, who has tossed him in the air, never stops smiling joyously, knowing he is in her loving arms. As he was dying in a strange bed at an obscure railhold that he would make famous by his departure, Tolstoy would see before him his deceased daughter. He would reach out and call to her, Masha, Masha. They say that the people who we love and who have come for us, thus Masha, who had already been opened up for a new life, came to help her father to be opened up. Haji Murat is one of Tolstoy's last texts, published posthumously. It is the story of the endless Chechen war my country has been waging for just shy of 200 years, with no end to this war in sight. He himself was in a Caucasus war, and these impressions would stay with him his whole life. Half a century later, he returned to this theme once again. Here are Chechens returning to their settlement after an attack by the Russians. Sado returned to his village and found his hut destroyed. The roof caved in, and the door and columns of the small gallery burned, and the interior befouled. His son, that handsome boy with the flashing eyes, who had gazed ecstatically at Haji Murat, was brought dead to the mosque on a horse covered with a felt cloak. He had been bayoneted in the back. The decorous woman who had served Haji Murat during his visit and who now, wearing a shirt torn at the breast, revealing her old sagging breasts with her hair let down, was standing over her son and scratching her own face, bloody and wailing without cease. It took Tolstoy a very long time to write this novella. The first version was ready in August 1896, but he worked on it for another 8 years. The writer hadn't worked that long on either War and Peace or Anna Karenina. In the end, he abandoned the novella, deciding that it had failed. This stunning text absolutely does not fit into Tolstoy's image of the world. It openly contradicts it. The vital strength of Haji Murat frankly overturns everything the writer said and preached about non-resistance to evil and evangelical love. This novella, in which everything is permeated with death, is a genuine hymn to earthly life. This is a text that rebels against its creator. In Haji Murat, Tolstoy suffers a crushing defeat as a philosopher and ethicist. The writer's pen, with all its graphic Tolstoyan might, did not leave a stone standing from all his sermons and dogmas. The image of broken but living burdock becomes a symbol of life. One needs to cling to every moment of being, fight for every breath. One needs to live according to the true laws of existence, either do or be done to. One needs to fight for the right to live up until the very end, not worrying about the mysteries of the universe or the deep connections between things, not digging into endless whys and to wherefores, not thinking about searching for meaning. Haji Murat can't be broken, just destroyed. He personifies vitality itself, the earthly life force in its pure form, without any admixtures of soul-searching or philosophizing. The ordinary burdock by the road becomes the source of that vital energy, whose flow no one can resist, even Tolstoy. In this text, there is no non-resistance to evil whatsoever. Here people fight good and evil without distinguishing one from the other, and they know no form of fighting for life other than violence. Here, insatiable hunger for life rules. The song of Haji Murat's brother overturns all the dogmas of Tolstoy the preacher. The land on my grave will dry out, and you will forget me, my dear mother. The cemetery will grow up in the grave grass, and the grass will muffle your grief, my old father. The tears in my sister's eyes will dry, and the grief will fly from her heart. You, older brother mine, will not forget me, though until you avenge my death. You, second brother mine, will not forget me until you lie down beside me. Hot you are, you bullet, and you carried death. But was it not you who was my faithful slave? Black earth, you will cover me. But was it not I who trampled you with my steed? Cold you are, death, but I was your master. The earth will take my body, the sky my soul. In this song, we hear the most indomitable flow of life, which Tolstoy wanted to stand crosswise with all his protests and rebellions, and whose current swept him away like a broken branch. Was this why he worked so long on this short novella, almost 10 years, because it was his final battle with his own pen? His pen emerged victorious. The writer admitted his defeat. This mighty man was powerless in the face of life. All his life, Tolstoy was afraid of dying. He was tormented by this fear, as his Ivan Ilyich was tormented as he lay dying. Whereas Haji Murad, who never gave such things a thought, died an easy and handsome death. This is precisely what Tolstoy sought his whole life, but an easy and handsome death was not his lot. It was a head, shaven, with a large jutting skull over his eyes, and a cropped black beard and short moustache, with one eye open and the other half closed, with a split but not entirely hacked, shaved skull, with a bloodied nose caked in black blood. His neck was wrapped in a bloody towel. Despite all the wounds on his head, there was a good, childish expression in the set of his blue lips. It all began with a chopped-off head in Paris and ended with the chopped-off head of Haji Murad. Tolstoy in his story Lucerne. Infinite is the kindness and wisdom of that which allowed and ordered all these contradictions to exist. Thank you very much.